Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today we have a fascinating conversation in store for you that is both political and philosophical in nature. Joining us today is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members, including our Director of Visual Art, Ramon Garcia, our member from Texas, who heads the Texas Transhumanist Party, Crowley, our Director of Community and Citizen Science, who also ran as our Vice Presidential candidate in 2024, Daniel Twedt, and our special guest today is Brandon King, who is currently running as a candidate for the Minnesota House District 20A, and he is seeking the U.S. Transhumanist Party's endorsement of his candidacy. We have set up this virtual enlightenment salon so that you, our audience, could get to know Brandon a bit better, some of his background, some of his journey, and some of his policy proposals and ideas, because he definitely touches on a lot of themes that are important to us transhumanists. Today, we will be discussing subjects such as sovereign homes, liberation infrastructure, and his non-mystical view of the technological singularity, which I think will be a fascinating topic to delve into. So, Brandon, welcome. Thank you for being here. And please tell us a bit more about yourself, your background, how you came to be involved in transhumanism, how you came to be involved in politics, and some of your key campaign proposals.
So I first got involved with politics in middle school at the end of the W era, beginning of the Obama era. Back then, I was a conservative, then self-radicalized online into the end-timer conspiracy theory side. And then after de-radicalizing and then losing my faith around 2010, that was when I became a transhumanist. So I've been a transhumanist about half my life now. I'm turning 32 next month. I was 16 in 2010. And literally it was the Harvard mice study with telomerase. That was in 2010. That was what got me. That was what made me realize this is more than just like hype. There's actual science behind radical life extension. And while we've never actually talked like this, I've been casually acquainted with you for many years. And in a way, this is kind of a homecoming for me because Hank Pellissier tasked me with creating the original USTP Facebook group back in like 2013. I was barely a kid, so I was a terrible admin, but...
Yes, this is quite fascinating. And indeed, we have in our U.S. Transhumanist Party Constitution some statements of historical fact that are quite interesting, because we did merge with the U.S. Longevity Party in 2020, and part of the statements of historical fact were in relation to the founding of the United States Longevity Party. So historical fact
yes, the U.S. Longevity Party, that was it.
Yes. So historical fact number 5 is that the United States Longevity Party was founded on January 1st, 2012 by Hank Pellissier. And then historical fact number 6 is that the second person to have held the title of chairman in the history of the Longevity Party is Brandon King. So you are in our Constitution in recognition of that history. Tell us a bit more about that. How did that arise that you then became the chairman of the U.S. Longevity Party? I know Hank Pellissier...
Hank just wanted to, he wanted to get less involved and asked if I would step up. But again, I had no idea what I was doing. I did the best that I could for a couple years, but Yeah, then it just kind of started getting way out of my hands, and I'm glad that you guys took over, honestly.
Yes, and that is interesting because I knew Hank during that time period, and I know that Hank Pellissier has a tendency to start various initiatives. He started various publications too, and then hand them over to other people. So that is what happened to you. Now, how did your views evolve during that time period, and what were your impressions of the longevity field in the early to mid 2010s as compared to what it has become today?
So my politics, after I de-radicalized from the far right, I kind of drifted towards libertarianism at first, but it was transhumanism that made me a socialist. Like, I didn't start at class consciousness, that came after for me, because it was internalizing the zero marginal cost and exponential growth. Like, once they converge, at that point, profit just becomes parasitism. Like, once zero marginal cost is across the board, even a cent of profit is 100% profit. Understanding that is what generally like shifted me towards the left.
So it's interesting because in various fields of emerging technologies, it is possible to produce certain kinds of goods and services essentially free of cost. One example is provision of email services or data storage, for instance, which used to be fairly scarce. Like in the 1990s, one would pay $39, $40 per month for a typical email account. And sometime around the early 2000s, free email accounts became widely available. And right now, it seems to me a lot of the services that require one to pay for premium tiers of data storage aren't doing it because they couldn't readily provide that storage free of cost. They're doing it because that is their particular model of revenue generation. But there are increasing numbers of areas where people can, in principle, access services free of charge. And of course, one aspect of the transhumanist vision is the possibility of what is called sustainable superabundance, where more aspects of the material world could be reproduced so cheaply as to be virtually free. So I wonder, though, what that would imply for, let's say, standard classifications of economic systems. In the 20th century and in the 19th century, there were well-defined ways to characterize capitalism and socialism, whereas it seems to me in the early 21st century, we're already getting to a situation where it's not clear that a particular arrangement neatly fits within one or the other. So is a private entity giving you free data capitalism or socialism? It doesn't seem to be either. Likewise, a universal basic income isn't necessarily socialism in my view. It would depend on how it's funded. If it's a redistributive UBI, it might be socialism. If it's a UBI that is arrived at from, say, a federal land dividend, as Zoltan Istvan proposes, by renting out unused federal land to private entities and using the proceeds to pay for a universal basic income, that's not exactly capitalism because the government is still doing this, but it's not socialism in the traditional way where there is some sort of centralized control over the economy. Rather, the government is simply administering proceeds that wouldn't have been generated otherwise. So I am not sure if the old isms really describe that kind of world, but I am curious about your view of what you call Enlightenment socialism and how that would differ from other forms of socialism, historical forms of socialism, or Marxist socialism, or socialism as it has been implemented and practiced in the 20th century, be it in the communist countries, at least countries that called themselves communist, or in the democratic socialist countries, say in Scandinavia.
So Enlightenment Socialism is a transitional phase in my mind. And for me, UBI, I believe the proper thing to do is to nationalize asteroid mining and then fund it that way. So Enlightenment Socialism originated as Bakunin social anarchism updated for the 21st century. It is almost entirely derived originally from a single quote in Bakunin's Stateless Socialism, where he explains that we're not defining socialism as anything but returning to the great principle of the French Revolution, that we should basically define life and try and create a society where the primary goal is human flourishing, where you are born with the material means you need to live your best life. And that's largely where it originated. And generally, I tend to discard much of the 20th century, which is where the Enlightenment prefix comes from, and focus mainly on like the 17 and 1800s, because socialism originated as part of the Enlightenment project before it got bastardized by the authoritarians in the 20th century. Well, you wanted to hear my thoughts on the state of longevity research, is that correct?
Yes, not just your views on longevity research, at least in terms of how you perceive it, how you respond to it, but also the longevity community, the movements that are advocating for longevity to be reached in time for us. What have you observed in terms of the evolution of those movements? What are your impressions?
So I am very unhappy with the direction of the research. Pills, gene therapy treatments, shots, things that could be easily gatekept or used as a means of societal control. Personally, I'm more fond of, say, a 3D printed gland that produces stem cells and then naturally heals your body after it's implanted. Something that you don't need to go to the doctor every month for a new injection, I generally trust the people doing the research. It's the people funding the research that I do not trust.
It's interesting because some of that is just a function of the technical feasibility of certain treatments. And I have asked before, what would the experience of going to a rejuvenation clinic look like in, say, 10 to 15 years if the first generation of therapies to reach longevity escape velocity becomes available? What would that experience be like? And the response that I've received has typically been that it would resemble a typical medical clinic visit as patients experience it today. So yes, you would perhaps get some injections, you would get some pills. The methods of administration would be familiar enough that most patients wouldn't perceive this to be anything too invasive or anything too novel. And there is a benefit to that in the sense that this would provide a certain continuity of experience. As you pointed out, one would essentially need to have these treatments administered in a controlled medical setting. Now, 3D printed organs are a field that is advancing. Indeed, for now a decade and a half, scientists have known how to 3D print simpler hollow organs, tracheas, for example. It's harder to do with organs that have a very complex morphology or a lot of functional parts, like it's harder to 3D print a heart, though there have been models of hearts that have been created and have been functional through that process. Now, of course, the challenge there is if you get some sort of 3D printed part, yes, hypothetically that part could be printed, but then the procedure of implanting it is a very invasive medical procedure.
Well, of course, but for the life of the organ, it would be only a one-time thing until you need to get it replaced.
Yeah.
Yes. So, Alan, go ahead.
Oh, I really appreciate the clarity on your website. I want to say that right up front. I went through there and read a lot of great ideas. I have some concerns for you. One is a very simple fix. You got the two proposals, which sound fantastic. I read over the sovereignty, home sovereignty 2027. That one looks like it's pretty solid. The place on your website where it says click on my other one about the work week also provides the
that's because both are unfortunately they're both in the same article on Substack.
Aha. Well, that might be something. Okay. Well, the other thing is, I really love the idea of time and space, and how you've like worked that together as a starting point for both of these things, time and space, but also even in the development of the administrative timeline and the functioning of it. You've allowed for, at least with the sovereign homes, the using those parcels of land that are not tax worthy, I guess, of the city to really manage.
That's why this is more of a state level pilot than like a town level,
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like you might need to go statewide to get those building assets together. We'll call it the agency because you do. The agency would have the 3 hubs. I think you mentioned 3 hubs to do building, and you probably need state resources. The city's not going to pull off building a hub by itself. Looked like that was the right place to plan and the right level. You gave it a nice timeline. It's not like 2007, we're going to sign the bill and houses start rolling off the assembly line. Let's get the funding and the legalities together and bring it, together by 2008, and then start the building out the infrastructure, the hubs and all that in 2009 or 2029, I think you said, to start actually producing houses. So I think that's a great kind of smart timeline. I've seen worse, I guess, in my time. So yeah, it looks like you got a really good plan there. My concern is the whole time and space thing resonates so well with me and my neurodivergent self that, yeah, you're hitting your target audience, but you might not be including enough folks to get elected with that time and space.
See, that's the beauty of it. Space and time. Everybody needs a place to be and time to become someone. And especially today with the 50-year mortgages and Elon Musk's $1 trillion pay package based on Optimus being able to take over most, if not all, jobs by 2040. They're writing my talking points for me at this point.
Yes, it's interesting because the 50-year mortgage proposal does seem to me to be a form of indentured servitude. And if one does the mathematics relative to a 30-year mortgage, for most people, the monthly payment will be reduced by maybe a couple $100, which is
it's like $200 or $300, and it adds, and you're paying $1 million just in the interest alone.
Yes. So,
but it only lowers it by a couple hundred.
I would like to address that point, though. A friend of mine, his family has lived in France and in Paris for a long time. He's a retired admiral in the French Navy. But his family home, I think it had a 50-year mortgage. However, they've been in it well over 150 years. It's not a standalone home. That's an in-town apartment. So they've got, it's a square building with a square courtyard in the middle that was originally designed for horses and carriage garages underneath. Adapted to cars. They all park inside now. There's 3 levels of housing and I think 4 units per level. So it's a big 4-story city block in Paris. And they're on the, one quarter of one floor there. Again, he and his family have not paid anything on the house except maintenance taxes and maintenance. But the house was on a 50-year mortgage. I think part of that, it's built of solid stone, and that thing will be there in another 100 years. I'm sitting in a house that's over 85 years old now, so built in 38. So
my house was built in 1905.
Yeah, hey, there you go. We have built great homes in the past, and I think now what we do is we tend to, use a lot of gypsum, a lot of pine grown in the Northeast or Northwest rather. We ship it to wherever it needs to go using fossil fuel and trucks. And then we slap it together as fast as possible with the least, the least skills, that we can design it to be built by. It's hard to find, replacement parts, so to speak, for this home. Like I said, built in the 30s, not built 1930, not 1905, but because everything now is prefab. People like, oh, I've got my prefab windows. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's carpenters or whatever that know how to install a window of any size, but yeah, then you got to find a glazier that'll cut you a window like that shape. So it's interesting to me that it's not just the time, it's the space, right? If the space is going to last 100 years, right? Build a 50-year mortgage isn't that bad. I mean, I say that, but depending on the place. But yeah, go ahead.
I think the issue is also in terms of expected lifespans. Now, ideally, in a transhumanist future, people's life expectancies will skyrocket. But right now, if a 20-year-old, say, is fortunate enough to receive a 50-year mortgage, he will be 70 when that mortgage is paid off, assuming he doesn't make prepayments. Making prepayments is always a wise idea, by the way, because it directly reduces the principal balance, whereas early on in the life of a mortgage, the overwhelming majority of the payment is comprised of interest. So if you have a mortgage and you can afford to make prepayments, I would highly recommend it. But I also think there's a cultural aspect to this, to homes being built to last, homes intended to be passed through multiple generations of a family. And we don't see that as much in contemporary societies anymore for a variety of reasons. Some of them may just be due to greater geographical mobility among people, but others may be due to an erosion of a kind of sense of continuity or a sense of belonging that used to exist. And that may be a more deleterious trend. But Daniel, do you have any thoughts, comments?
Yeah, Brandon, hurrah for you standing for office. I've done this a few times in my own, time. But, I see the governance of spaceship or Starship Earth actually as a Bucky Fuller kind of thing, where we have the capability to take care of everyone with no one living at the advantage of anyone else. And I love the term Enlightenment Socialism. I think the problem with socialism is it gets bundled with authoritarianism. And I think that's completely unnecessary when you consider the work of Henry George. And I wonder how you feel about expanding beyond the cradle planet and taking us out to the resources of the solar system and eventually the galaxy.
I would absolutely love to discuss that, because my dream career is to be a cosmic engineer. And that is something that I cannot do if the axis of Endarkenment wins, because humanity will not make it to the next century if we go down this route of Ready Player One Elysium. Now, because I'd assume that everybody here identifies as an extropian, correct?
Yes.
I would say so.
Okay. Yeah. So in my opinion, entropy is the tyranny. Like, a perfect universe is a cold, dead, still, lifeless universe. That is a perfect universe. I don't see us as the universe experiencing itself. I believe in the Gaia hypothesis. We are Gaia experiencing herself. And has anybody here played Final Fantasy VII?
No.
So there's a concept in that game called the life stream, where it's a stream of energy in the planet. And I believe that our planet has an analogous life stream that's the sum total energy of the biosphere. Like the soul, it's the bioelectricity that powers our body and brains. And when we die, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. It returns to the planet, rejoins the life stream. And that's what makes our planet different from, say, Mars or Neptune. We have a living biosphere. And I have this theory that perhaps across trillions of years and trillions of terraformed planets, that you might be able to forge, say, a hypothetical cosmic life stream that shifts the entropy balance just enough to prevent the universe from spreading apart with the heat death. We can, say, keep everything together because, I mean, the heat death presumes that nothing interferes. Life is that extropic counterforce, not necessarily humanity, because if we fail, then Gaia is just going to try it the next runner-up. It's life itself.
I totally agree. The cosmic mission of life is to prevent the heat death of the universe. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. I'm just taking. I couldn't get that to fly in Texas, but I love the message.
Well,
I'm glad that I'm doing this because this is the first place where I can naturally talk about these things, and I don't have to educate you guys on all the initial topics. You guys just get it.
Yeah.
So this is a very unique moment for me.
We're waiting for the heat death of the universe because the price of oil is going to boom. I mean, it's terrible.
No, I think the two political parties should be the extropy party and the entropy party, right? It's like,
well, that's the thing. Like the Endarkenment, as I call them, they are servants of entropy. They absolutely are. Because what is tyranny and control and hierarchy if not entropy?
Yes.
What is this? Yeah. I mean,
interestingly, I have a video called Transhumanism and the Second Law of Thermodynamics, where I discuss the posited heat death of the universe, and I make the point that this hypothesis relies on the universe being a closed system. And I make an argument for why that's not the case vis-a-vis the universe as a whole. And indeed, humankind or sentient life can be an extropic force that counters the entropy that would occur in closed systems without any sort of external intervention. And I think that's an important point for transhumanists to consider, that we are not fated to be destroyed really on any time scale. The question is, can we figure out ways to prevent our own individual destruction, our society's destruction, our species' destruction in time for us to be these extropic agents? And I do think the century that we live in, the 21st century, is a pivotal time in the sense that the trajectory of our species could be glorious, or it could be devastating, or it could end very quickly if there's a nuclear war, for instance. But I was curious, Brandon, since you mentioned this term, the Endarkenment, how do you perceive it? Because there is the term, the Dark Enlightenment, from the so-called neo-reactionaries, people like Curtis Yarvin, who are opposed to the Enlightenment as it was conceived of during the 18th century, and they propose a kind of return to, for lack of a better word, neo-medieval institutions where there is more hierarchy and more control. And of course, transhumanism is not neo-reactionary. We are opposed to neo-reactionary thinking. But how do you see the Endarkenment in relation to those ideas?
So Curtis Yarvin's Dark Enlightenment is actually where I coined the term Endarkenment, because just calling a spade, like how it's an oxymoron. How do you darken the light without endarkening it at the end of the day? But then when you really think about it, it maps on to American history perfectly. Calling it like the loyalists versus the revolutionaries, Endarkenment versus Enlightenment. Then the Confederate versus the Union, Endarkenment versus Enlightenment. The segregationists versus the integrationists, Endarkenment versus Enlightenment. MAGA versus us, Endarkenment versus Enlightenment. It maps on cleanly across all of American history because it is at its core, it's the underlying anti-enlightenment countercurrents that's always existed. Like where we have liberty, equality, and dignity, they have tyranny, hierarchy, and control.
So along these lines, where do you think the motives for an endarkenment type of mentality stem? Because throughout history, these weren't necessarily the same people. So, for instance, the Confederates and Curtis Yarvin are not from the same, let's say, direct...
The same fold, yeah.
Sequence, yes. They arrived at their conceptions, which may be similar in practice in terms of how they're implemented in terms of policies, but the Confederates arose in a kind of different society, in a different intellectual ecosystem from Curtis Yarvin, who, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have any direct links to the South during the early to mid 19th century, and yet he does want to see the return of these hierarchical structures.
So, have you ever heard of the Illuminati?
I have.
It's what I call the axis of endarkenment, because it's not reptilians, it's just the rich. All right, so like George Carlin said, I believe in 2001, that you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. And that's what's going on here. It's a convergence and alignment of interests and incentives among the global oligarchs, the technocrats, the feudalists, the theocrats, the autocrats, and the techno-feudalists. They are all united in control and authoritarianism, regardless of what flag they fly or what side of the aisle they're on.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why they are sort of this current, I don't know, I see the headlines like strife within MAGA, the regime is breaking apart and all these things. But basically, they are having their own little internecine warfare. Candace Owens talking bad about, Charlie Kirk.
That's because there's many sub-factions here. Like you got the techno-feudalists, you got the business plotters from the Business Plot 2.0. They descend from the Powell Memo. You got the Christian Dominionists, and then even among those, you got smaller sects like with Candace Owens. She's one of those who, when it comes to like Israel and Palestine, it's like she's right, but she's wrong about why she's right.
So it's interesting, though, that you mentioned the Illuminati, and here's the Wikipedia entry on them. The actual historical Illuminati in the 18th century were a Bavarian secret society.
Yeah, they were just a bunch of free thinkers.
Yes, to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment. And this is what the Wikipedia page reads. The society's stated goals were to oppose superstition, obscurantism, religious influence over public life, and abuses of state power by monarchs. The order of the day, they wrote in their general statutes, is to put an end to the machinations of the purveyors of injustice, to control them without dominating them. So, interestingly enough, the vision of the original Illuminati more resembles your vision than the Endarkenment, because
I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said that the Illuminati would not need to be a secret society in America because they were in theocratic Bavaria at the time. But that's why I use the term axis of Endarkenment, because that's really what it is. It's an axis among the Endarkenment they're trying, whether it's the Duginists in Russia, the Yarvinites here, they're trying to roll back the Enlightenment.
Yes, there does seem to be a push in the direction of authoritarianism, in the direction of command and control erosion of civil liberties today. And I am concerned that a lot of wealthy people who in prior eras seem to be a bit more libertarian, like Elon Musk, for instance, have instead decided to throw their lot in, at least temporarily, or so I hope, with these more authoritarian forces. What Elon Musk tried to do with DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. On the one hand, efficiency in government is a reasonable goal, noble ideal. On the other hand, indiscriminately cutting air traffic controllers or Ebola responders or other workers that are critical to maintaining the infrastructure that people depend on doesn't seem to be a viable plan to actually achieve efficiency. It's more like slash and burn, cut first, ask questions later. And I didn't really see any sort of principled motivation behind it. Now, on the other hand, Elon has had a falling out with Trump in several ways, and I'm not sure they've exactly reconciled, though certainly they're not hurling allegations at one another nearly as much. But I wonder, in your view, how heterogeneous or homogeneous is this group? Is it possible to have allies within some of these circles, like some people who might have been closer to these illiberal regimes or illiberal tendencies at one point, but maybe they've changed their mind. Maybe they've seen the error of these arrangements. Maybe they've been burned, and maybe they will realize that it's not a good idea to make common cause with authoritarians or would-be authoritarians.
Okay, so first off, the tech elite, if you remember, I mentioned earlier Elysium and Ready Player One. I have firmly believed for the last decade that's their end goal. All right, that is the techno-feudalists, the Yarvins, the Vances, the Thiels, the Musks. They have decided to embrace humanity going extinct with a small pocket of elites surviving in their gilded ivory space habitat orbiting a climate change ravaged Earth. And then that's what I believe their long game is, which is why around 2018 they started really allying themselves with the right. And then I was just about to go into one of the other points on this, but it just slipped. Dang it! Oh yes, they are in Ouroboros. They are the dark side of the force at the end of the day. And as we all know, the dark side eats itself. You know, it's based on betrayal.
Well, I just want to, I kind of want to point out that I think this is a long-term game's not the right word, but this conflict is not new. I kind of think back to the Israelites and the Canaanites living side by side in the worship of Baal versus the worship of Yahweh, and how the Israelites were like, hey, we're all going to get wrapped up in trying to outdo each other if we keep working like 24/7 all the way through, right? Why 24/7? Just make it 24 every day you work. We need a day off, right? Like, let's have a day to reflect on that, what we've done. Whereas the Canaanite philosophy was like, sacrifice your children for greater rewards now, right? So, which, to your point, I mean, whether that's using up resources now or, using up what our children would inherit from us, whether that's a clean planet or a pile of money, if you use that up, you're basically sacrificing the future for the present, as opposed to sacrificing, not sacrificing, I guess.
And they knew this. They were warned that they were selling their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren's future back in the 80s. Like, it's not like they weren't warned.
Oh yeah. Even even on the planetary health, back from the 60s with Rachel Carson and others. I mean, those are all legitimate concerns that have probably been wrapped into a political movement that has nothing to do with actually, taking care of the planet we live on, right? It's not a spaceship Earth movement. It's more about stopping energy use, which that's not good either.
Yes, or NIMBYism. So speaking of that and tying this to the issue of housing, I would venture to say housing affordability is the major political issue in the United States today. It is the issue that affects and concerns the vast majority of Americans, even to the point where upper middle class people have difficulty affording homes. And you have the Minnesota Housing Sovereignty Act, and this is a response to decades of housing scarcity now. I would say one principal cause of housing scarcity is NIMBYism. It is the result of local activists, whether from the left or from the right, by the way. So in northern Nevada, there's a significant constituency of elderly Republicans who want to keep their areas, quote, rural in their view. So they oppose any new residential construction. And in states like California, usually the opposition comes from left-wing so-called community groups that just want to freeze the character of a neighborhood in its present state. But in either case, these groups make it very difficult to build new homes. You have an innovative proposal, the Minnesota Housing Sovereignty Act, which would actually lead to the creation of 3D printed homes that would be provided to individuals as homesteads under a stewardship contract. So could you please describe the details of this proposal so that our viewers understand what it entails and how it would be unique?
So I have been keeping an eye on 3D printed housing since 2014. When I was truck driving, it was a dream of mine to buy some land and then get a house 3D printed on there. Getting a mortgage for my 1905 home ended up being a bit more realistic in the short term. But okay, so the reason NIMBYism is a big reason why I'm going for a state level program instead of local, and then that's also one of the reasons why I want us to rely mostly on the state's existing inventory of land. And then so the way that it would work is you would open up the 3D design studio, you would build your dream house, and then it would be constructed. And then you would then live in that house for the 15 years. You're paying under $600 a month to be a homeowner. And yeah, like when you compare that to the existing market, the 30 to 50-year mortgages.
Yes, that would definitely be favorable from the standpoint of the homeowner. So in terms of the logistics of that, would the $600 per month be paid to the government or the governmental entity that constructed these homes? Or if you have some
Yes,
sort of
it would essentially be a revolving trust. It would essentially be a revolving trust with the payments, the monthly payment you make then goes to fund future developments.
Yes, so that makes sense to use the proceeds to fund the construction of additional homes. And what happens after the 15-year term elapses? So let's say this person has reliably made the $600 payments and has taken care of the house. Does that title to the home then become
free and clear?
Yeah, free and clear. Okay.
The only caveat would be you would not be able to resell it unless you resell it at the same market rate as the other sovereign homes. The whole point is to make sure that we lock speculation entirely out of it, because it would be functionally an entirely separate parallel housing market.
So the resale would only be allowed to another natural person or family, not to, say, a corporation.
Not to a corporation. I personally believe that any corporation should be banned from buying residentials. Let them keep their speculative games with the business real estate.
Yes, and there have been various proposals in state legislatures, for instance, to cap the number of homes in the state that are allowed to be purchased by private entities. I do tend to think that this could be an undue restraint on the supply of single-family homes if too many of them are converted to rentals by corporations whose business model is of that nature. Now, it does seem to me that there needs to be a supply side solution. So whatever the case is with restrictions on, let's say, corporate home buying, there will need to be a dramatic increase in just the number of homes available, because the population has grown to a significant extent since the 1990s, for instance, when home prices were more reasonable, and there simply needs to be more developed real estate to house all of the additional people who exist now. What do you see in terms of the prospects for savings, in terms of the costs of materials, in terms of the costs of construction that would be made possible by emerging technologies? I think this is where really a lot of the scarcity problems can be solved, but please go ahead.
So the savings is really where all of numbers make the most sense. I mean, like right now, Minnesota spends about 1.2 billion a year just on rental vouchers and developer incentives for luxury units that nobody can afford but BlackRock and Vanguard, you know? And I mean, 3D printed homes, as is, massively cheaper right out the gate. Like, we're talking under $100,000 for a home. And the thing is, when Icon first came on the scene and they were talking about their home prices, I didn't realize that they were not talking to me, random worker flipping foreclosed homes in Central Valley, California. They were talking to their shareholders. And that's the thing, like where the savings benefits, we don't see that. The shareholders do. And that's what I'm trying to change here, where the average person sees the benefits of the savings as well. Because I mean, if it doesn't change, if my price doesn't change, then it doesn't really matter either way what we do.
Could I jump in here with a thought? It seems to me that, the whole idea of Georgism is disconnecting the land value from the improvement on the land value. And if we had an easy way to build, say, houseboats, a houseboat can sit on land and be a house, or it can sit on the ocean and be a beautiful piece of habitat. So, I'm a proponent of the idea that we should build a life ring at the equator of habitats called sequatoria, and this would create a voluntary kind of socialist paradise for refugees of all the world, to live freely, on the equator of Earth, where there's very low wave energy and there's very maximum solar input energy. So couldn't we use the Henry George style of thought? I mean, we already pay property tax. We rent the land from the government, basically. If you don't pay your property tax, the government's going to seize your land back. But they won't.
Well, I mean, one of the main sources of land that I'm proposing is the tax forfeited land.
I didn't copy you.
Oh, sorry. One of the main sources of land that I'm proposing we take from is tax forfeited land.
Oh, yeah, which is a huge market. But why do we have tax forfeited land? Because we don't have land capitalism. We don't have a proper, valuing. We don't have a rental market that adjusts the property taxes with the value of the land. And they've done this, in places like Singapore, which has the highest land value in the world. And they basically have 99-year leases where the government allocates the land. And it basically works out, pretty well. But I'm thinking we could go one step beyond that and just make the whole Earth kind of, a houseboat, parking spot, and you could print.
See, that would be ideal. That would absolutely be ideal. Like, I am all for like every human being just being given a seastead. Like, we could fit all of the human population on like 1% of the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, you could fit all the people on Earth in Texas at the density of Tokyo, so that's kind of an interesting, thought experiment. But we really shouldn't be charging people for what they need to live, because that's slavery. If you say you can't get what you need to live without, giving up your life, I mean, that's the definition of slavery, pretty much. So
I often joke that the only hierarchy I accept is Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that would be a good starting point. But anyway, thanks for indulging my my thoughts there. Back to you.
So the space and time concept is that essentially you are trying to make sure that the lower rungs on the hierarchy of needs are fulfilled, and thereby people would have more room, more space for self-actualization. Now, interestingly enough, this is the page for Icon's Mueller Homes project in Austin, Texas, where they have several hundred 3D printed homes already that one can see they've been built, and one can view them online as well. So this is starting to happen, but you've characterized the prices of those homes as still being quite high relative to the cost of production because they're in the same market where housing is scarce. So essentially, the builder has an incentive to charge what the market will bear, and your plan creates this distinctive parallel market where you have fixed terms, essentially the $600 a month for 15 years. Now, are you going to have any sort of criteria for eligibility? And I'm just asking because I am curious about this, or would anybody be eligible if enough homes are built to become a homeowner pursuant to this arrangement as long as they adhere to the terms?
I'd imagine that the best situation would be a waitlist lottery sort of deal. But personally, especially during the pilot, I would love to see a ceiling for the pilot, like where like if you make a certain month, then you don't necessarily qualify to participate in the pilot. Because I would like for the average Minnesotan to be able to take part in this. And then, like, after the pilot, the legislation would have 1 in every 10 homes go towards the homeless. In Minnesota, we only have like 11,000 homeless people. I figure at that rate, we could end homelessness as a category of human within the state by the mid-2030s.
One of the platform proposals of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, which originated in response to the COVID pandemic, is to create 3D printed tiny home communities for the homeless, where the homes would not be as large necessarily as what you conceive of, because they're not intended as, let's say, the final homes for many of these people, but these people would be able to get free conditional title to those homes as long as they agree, for instance, to do some useful work, clean up litter, that kind of activity, and also as long as they agree not to bring drugs or alcohol onto the premises of that tiny home community, because we want it to be respectable and we want it to be free of the kinds of, let's say, behaviors or proclivities that might have contributed to these individuals' homelessness in the first place. But the idea is, if they adhere to those conditions, then they would be able to live in those houses free and clear for as long as they need, for as long as they haven't, for instance, found another job or found a better, more spacious place to live. And then once they do find a more spacious place to live, they might even be able to resell that tiny home to another individual. So would this also be a plan that you would consider maybe for the lower end? So if there is a homeless population and there's a need to get them housed very quickly, building those.
I mean, certainly for housing, larger numbers of people quickly and cheaply, yeah, like 3D printed tiny homes would be the way to go. The 1 in 10, that would be a much slower process of housing the homeless anyway, So, and that's why it would be more for the more regular sized homes that I'm imagining. But the Sovereign Design Studio, like the way that it would work is it would be like a Sims-like gamified environment where you'd literally just build your home. And I would like it to be open source. Like in the draft legislation, it states that it should be open source so that any other state would be able to just copy it as needed and then just adapt it to their own states if the federal government is dragging its feet.
Very interesting. And one of the advantages of 3D printing is indeed that one can provide one's own design. This happens all the time with small 3D printed objects where one could send over a file and then a service might 3D print the object and ship it to one's home. So in principle, this could be done with homes as well, as long as the designs are architecturally sound, but the studio could have built-in constraints within the software to, for instance, prevent one from building a design that will cave in or have other defects.
The primary constraint for the design studio would be that it's structurally sound.
Yes, that makes sense. Now, in terms of the implementation timeline, Alan had alluded to that in some of his remarks. How do you propose to go from the status quo to a situation where there is a thriving parallel market for these sovereign homes? Let's say the proposal gets enacted, so there's no longer political opposition, there's just the practical implementation of it.
Well, so that's the thing. At first, it'll be the first 1,500 to 5,000 homes for the pilot. And then after that, I am hoping that that would generate a measure of FOMO among everybody else. You know, like, why don't I deserve that? And then I'm hoping that it would then snowball from there. That's how I'm hoping that it would spread to other states after we've after we've gotten our pilot underway. You know, because then once people see it happening, then they can start looking around their own situation and being like, well, you know.
Can I inject something else? I don't know if you heard of the Dunbar number. There's an anthropologist named Robin Dunbar from Oxford who said about 150 to 250 people is the sweet spot for people to know and trust each other. So I think that actually happens to be about the number of people that live on the average neighborhood block. So I think we could redesign our cities with this in mind, and people could actually build these kind of translinkable communities that I think FM Esfandiari talked about. You know, people would translink every couple weeks to a new community, but I think it's quite possible to keep that Dunbar community number as a prototype aspect of building these new 3D printed communities. So,
I presume everybody here would be familiar with the Venus Project?
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, big fan.
So personally, I've always viewed the Venus Project as our reward for surviving the Great Filter. Like, we don't just get to create those cities like in 10 years. We got to earn the right after we've proven that we can steward the planet. And at that point, that's when you would look at like fully redesigning cities for sure. Because right now, the main thing would be making sure that people would have access to the same resources as everybody else. You know, where the location for where they're built.
Yeah, but that's really what gives, you know, cities value is what human resources you're close to. I mean, people love to go to theaters and shop and interact, you know, so that's
I would love to see them completely redesign cities one of these days, though. Like, the linear city is very inefficient.
Yeah, they abandoned that line city, I think, in the desert recently, probably for some of those reasons. But yeah, I love Edenicity. I don't know if you looked at Edenicity is making Eden-like cities. It's Kev Polk's concept. Edenicity.com. I'm a big fan of his work, and he's the first urban permaculturalist. Basically, I think he kind of invented the practice, but it's basically leaving this maximum wild nature around cities that are very efficiently clustered and kind of, you know, solar walkways about 4-story high, you know, multi-tenant buildings with car-free, and, you know, you have you know, human-powered solar-powered scooters to get around. I guess it's the 15-minute city, which, you know.
That all sounds amazing. I love permaculture.
Yeah,
just
yeah.
generally.
It's it doesn't quite translate into a Kardashev Dyson sphere, but I think there's a point where we can adapt permaculture to enlivening the cosmos. But that's something I'm working on. But yeah, it sounds like you're doing great work, Brandon. I really hope that Minnesota is such a forward-looking state. I mean, what part of Minnesota are you in, by the way?
So I live in Red Wing. District 20A runs from a town called Cannon Falls up towards Wabasha. We're out on the Mississippi River, like 40 miles from St. Paul to like the southeast.
Yeah, well, my district is District 5 here in Ventura County, Thousand Oaks, and we're surrounded by rings of open space. So I'm planning to run again when my district comes up for election in 2028. But yeah, I'll be totally on board with promoting the same kind of urban permaculture concepts that you're talking about. So great to have this dialogue.
Yes, and for our viewers, here is the site of the Venus Project. So the Venus Project was originated by Jacques Fresco, a long-lived futurist, by the way, who lived to the age of 101. And he conceived of this idea of a resource-based economy where through advanced technologies, sufficient resources could be produced and allocated to all of the residents without even the need for money. So it's an interesting concept, but it involves a lot of futuristic architecture of Jacques Fresco's design, as well as advanced logistics. And I do know of several transhumanists who have been participants in the Venus Project as well. Now, I am curious also about one of your other flagship proposals, which has to do with reducing the work week, the Minnesota Workweek Liberation Act. You made the point that automation is poised to take over various roles that human labor has historically performed, and those aren't always going to be manual jobs or menial jobs. Some of them might be more advanced kinds of work, including intellectual, cognitive work. It may be that the workplace will be transformed, that some new types of jobs will be created, but there will be people who will be displaced in the transition, people who would not have those new skills right away necessarily. But you've also made the point that the 40-hour work week is obsolete. So what are your thoughts on the 40-hour work week? How could it be sustainably scaled back? And what measures would there be to make sure that people maintain a similar standard of living in the course of that transition?
So first of all, Keynes himself said that by the year 2030, we would have a 15-hour work week. I'm pushing for 16 by 2040. I know that we're not going to get there by 2030. But I know it's normally not good practice to answer a question with a question, but when people ask me why 16 hours by 2040, I always respond to them and ask, what do you imagine Elon Musk has planned for his Optimus robot? Because it's not me saying that the jobs are going to be automated. I'm just saying either they're committing securities fraud on a $1 trillion global scale, and if they're lying, or we need to be talking about restructuring the social contract today if they're telling the truth. It's either or. There is no middle ground there. Either they're lying and they're committing securities fraud, or they're telling the truth, and we need to be prepared today.
It's interesting, too, because the 40-hour work week does seem like a social construct. And in the 19th century, it was an advancement largely at the behest of various labor groups, because in factories and mines and very dangerous conditions, there often weren't any real upper limits on how long people would work there. And sometimes people would work to exhaustion. And the 40-hour work week was intended to place a limit on that. At least if you work past that in certain occupations, you get paid overtime. Now, these days, the varieties of work that people perform are quite a bit more diverse. So not every job really truly requires 40 hours per week. Some jobs could reasonably entail more work that is still productive, others much less. And I would say the more important question is that individual producing the output that is deserving of that compensation, not how many hours that person essentially shows up in the office for. Especially for a lot of office jobs, there is this concept of FaceTime culture, which is really just people showing up to show that they have shown up, rather than necessarily spending that time in the most effective possible way. So what kinds of steps do you envision to change that culture? Because it seems to be ingrained as a societal norm, essentially, that you show up for 40 hours, even if you don't have 40 hours of work. How do you change that to saying you take the time you need to do the work, and the amount of work that's expected, if you want to reduce the work week to 16 hours by 2040, will be reasonably proportional to the hours available to do the work?
See, that is one of the reasons why it would be a phased transition. In addition to easing the load on the market itself with the transition, it would give people time to culturally adjust to the downward motion of hours. Because you think about it, before the 8-hour, they said that the 8-hour workday, 5 days a week and the weekend, they said that all of that was impossible until it happened.
Indeed. And it does seem to me that the predictions of individuals like Bertrand Russell and John Maynard Keynes, whom you mentioned, that their descendants would have 15-hour work weeks, appeared reasonable at the time, because they thought of how much labor would it take to satisfy the typical needs of a human in that
But
era.
like you pointed out, that's not how the office thinks, you know?
Right.
Like, they're not sitting there thinking in terms of productivity. It's more in perceived productivity.
Right. A lot of that has become more of a cultural expectation that is perpetuated for its own sake, rather than something that is strictly necessary. Now, the culture, of course, would have to adjust. And these days, a lot of people, mistakenly, I think, associate their identities, the sense of meaning that they get in their lives, with their jobs, their careers, the titles of what they do for a living, rather than a more multifaceted kind of perception. And for me, I find that personally rather odd, because I see myself as an individual first, not a particular job title. And I like to see myself as a Renaissance man or a man of the Enlightenment who can do any number of a wide range of activities, as long as I can understand the key premises behind those activities needed to carry them out well. So I find it strange that a lot of people tie the core essence of their being to some particular profession or occupation. How do you propose to transcend that mentality?
So one of my favorite words has always been eudaimonia. It's the Greek word, the closest translation is generally human flourishing. Aristotle called it the greatest good. And then, like Buckminster Fuller said, the goal should be getting back to thinking about what it is you were thinking about before someone told you to go earn a living. And that's the thing. Like, what I believe that the ultimate purpose of civilization should be is to create the conditions where every individual has the material means to self-actualize, to create their own meaning, to flourish. And that's how we shift it culturally, by making meaning making actually possible. Because right now, you can't really self-actualize unless you're rich or superhumanly determined.
And I think for a lot of people, the superhuman determination has to be a factor, even if they have money and other resources, because there are so many factors in our culture that try to channel people away from self-actualization. In particular, we live in a culture of distraction, and I fear social media have amplified that tendency toward distraction, because the technologies of social media and the internet have a tremendous potential for human liberation. They place all of the information in the world potentially at our fingertips, but the algorithms that feed us this information in spite of ourselves in places and times when we would rather not receive it can lead us astray and can hijack our psyches toward less than fully productive or optimal ends. And this seems to be a wider problem in the society in terms of how do we get people to find meaning in a way that they are in control of, that they have purposes, they have values, they have goals, and they're not dependent on a job or an algorithm or conformity to societal expectations. They are dependent on how that person uses reason and tries to fathom the world as it is and create something better for themselves, for other people, whatever aids in human flourishing. So that, I think, is the key challenge of the era we live in. And I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding what individuals could do. You've mentioned what policies might help in that regard, but individuals are participants in that process of finding meaning. And ultimately, any policy is there to enable the individual to become the best they can be, to achieve that eudaimonia, achieve that flourishing. So what would you say individuals can start doing today to get closer to that goal?
I mean, I don't really know how to answer that one because I'm not exactly self-actualized myself yet. But like you were saying, it's not the technology when it comes to social media, it's the algorithms. And that's the thing. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with the Luddite argument about mass automation, how everybody will just get lazy. I believe there's some minor truth to that, but it's a temporary situation. I believe that for averaging between 6 months to 2 years for most people, there will be a time where they will get lazy and they will like kind of shut down a bit and not know what to do because they don't know what to do. Like without work, what do they do? You know? And that's the thing. It really is very much an individual thing. Like my meaning of life is not necessarily the same as your meaning of life. And you need the time to figure yourself out to even know what your meaning is.
Yes, you need that intellectual room for exploration or breathing room free from the imminent constraints of the survival pressures that people face on a day-to-day basis. We have some interesting comments in our internal chat. Daniel Twedt writes, Ikigai is a Japanese concept meaning a reason for being, a sense of purpose that makes life worthwhile, often found at the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for, though it's also a more personal, humble pursuit of daily joys and contributions, not just a grand career goal. It combines Iki, life, and Gai, worth or value, leading to fulfillment, well-being, and longevity. So very interesting concept. I would say a transhumanistic concept of Ikigai. I would say actually in some aspects, not necessarily in all aspects of the work culture, but in some aspects of the broader culture, a lot of Japanese culture is implicitly transhumanist, though they wouldn't necessarily use that term for it. Alan Crowley,
they're just naturally very futuristic and forward-facing.
Yes, I've observed that. And of course, Japan has one of the longest life expectancies in the world today. So they are doing something right. Alan writes, I think of myself as unlimited by title, but as you can see, I use them as a test of the people I encounter. Do they see more than a title? So in effect, do they see the whole individual beyond the title? Very interesting way of approaching people. Alan, would you like to say more?
Yeah, I mean, also, I mean, my title is literally a retire. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel. So nobody asks me, well, what do you do now that you're retired, right? I mean, they keep paying me, so I think just like you say. I mean, it took me some time to say, what do I do now? I'm not used to the structure. I'm unfamiliar with the structure. I'm unfamiliar with the I went all that civilian life. I spent part of my time in the reserves and worked outside of the military. But yeah, I mean, it's also just a way to. It's hard for me to hit people with like 5,000 things that I'm interested, like longevity, seasteading. You know, I want to find out about interesting proposals in Minnesota, Brandon, so that we can copy them here in Texas. It'll take us a decade, and it'll have to be one city that gets it done because it's not going to come out of Austin. But yeah, at least maybe by the time have changed around here, there'll be a track record in Minnesota. But yeah, just this idea, it's hard for me to throw a whole lot of who I am out there, right? Without saying, hey, just look at this narrow slice for a moment, right? Get focused on, you know, I did that for 32 years. So that's something I did, you know, whatever. But it's not what I do now. You know, I do all kinds of things now. It's pretty rewarding. Well, the other ones too, but I found new rewards.
You found
and that's
new
the thing.
rewards.
You needed time to find that, you know, like they fear monger about the laziness because they don't want people to stop working, but it's going to be a temporary thing. You know, they just need to decompress from the life of work and then figure out what it is that they actually want to do.
Very interesting. So now I think it's a good opportunity for Art Ramon to ask any questions about what we have discussed thus far.
Yeah, as far as work, I'm sort of an artist part-time when I'm not working my day job. And I've written a book where I advocate using the arts to help people sort of cope with that joblessness, you know, during economic singularity. And I've promoted that. It's one day it's going to have to be used. It's probably going to take the government to implement such a program because, you know, the private sector isn't going to do it. They're going to have the most resources to do that. But even with myself as an individual, I work a lot. I work for the government. We've lost a lot of people because of the DERP, and I work even more now. Lots of overtime. When I go to sleep, sometimes I don't dream about art. I dream about working and working on technology. I can't escape my work, even in my dreams. So yeah, it's very mind-consuming. You know, if I didn't have to work, I'd be doing art full time, but I have to use a small amount of spare time I have when I'm not working and doing other chores to use that to try and do, you know, that self-actualization, working on art. So I would see art as a way of helping people adapt to that joblessness, to not knowing what to do. On top of other things, let's say like people would be into weightlifting and weightlifting competitions, marathons. There are people who would sort of take the athletic route, you know, and do competitive performance in those types of sports. So sports, arts, basically going back to the old early civilization when you have the artisan class, you had the worker class replaced, but you still had kind of the military class and the noble class. So sort of along that route. Of course, we're not going to have certain parts of that, but we're still going to have the artisan class and people who compete in physical type sports. So that I see happening. The sports, you know, the arena sports, that will continue. So that's one way of coping. Another thing, I live here in Tucson, and there's been a problem with homelessness. And they've had like entire areas that they call it 100 acres woods that people would just camp out at. And they cleared it out, and they've tried to control the homelessness, at least where they camp out, by creating sort of a tent city area on city-owned land. And it's basically just small little tents. And that's one way they've tried to help out with the homeless situation. But I go to a gym, and there's a lot of homelessness around the area. That was a guy who lived out of his truck for 3 whole years, parked in the same spot. And he would sit on his side of his truck and basically spend the entire day sitting on a little chair outside of his truck while his truck is just packed of every single one of his belongings. So 3 years, I saw this guy every Thursday sitting there and living out of his truck. And he finally left after 3 whole years of seeing this guy. He's gone now. It's been replaced by a bigger camper. But a lot of homeless in that area, those people have not taken advantage of this city-sponsored encampment. But what are your ideas for the people who can't afford that $600? How is the city going to help people who are homeless, who have drug addiction issues, and have health issues? I mean, that's going to take a lot of money to take care of people who have these problems. What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, homelessness itself. Karl Marx called the fact that the homeless exist. He called it the reserve army of labor. That's basically their function to society. They are a threat, like a premonition of what awaits us if we don't do what the bosses say, and they are an easy source of labor if the bosses suddenly need a new influx of labor. But so the idea would be that I don't yet know exactly what length of time it would be, but there should be a period where they aren't paying on the home and they're in fact just getting their life together. Because $600 a month, like you could do some DoorDash and make $600 a month. You know, like you just got to get your life together at a basic level first. If you're coming in for homelessness.
Yes, and perhaps there could be a period of forbearance, and that could be combined with perhaps an expectation to repay that amount later. So if there's a 15-year time frame, there might be the option to shift that out by a few months if one has certain time periods when one is ill, for instance, or otherwise indisposed and incapable of making those payments. So I am sure that there could be some flexible options in that regard. Now, I also liked Art Ramon's comments on artistic creativity and how that will be a way for humans to apply their energies, even if they don't have to work for a living. And indeed, even if robots and AIs can also create art, because individual humans can still create different art or with different media or with just different premises. For instance, I can assign a particular prompt to a generative AI, and that AI might do a good job with that prompt, but I myself directly could create something different, or Art Ramon could create something different from what I would create. And still the way in which we do it, our process, the materials we use, all of these aspects will differ from how the AI would approach that task. So I think AIs don't compete with human artists. AIs complement human artists. Daniel Twedt has an interesting comment. Art is the humane response to the dehumanizing. So art can provide social commentary, to be sure. Art can, though, also be used for the purpose of pure enjoyment or experiencing the world in a different way or seeing aspects of the world that one wouldn't see otherwise. So there are many distinct purposes for art, but I agree that this is an area where more humans could spend their time if they lived in a society of automated abundance. Daniel, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of things in the urban landscape that could provide job opportunities. I was watching the COSCA meeting, which is the Conejo Open Space Conservation Agency, and they were lamenting the fact that there were these thousands of Mexican fan palms that are invasive, and they need to get rid of them because there is a such thing as exotic invasive species in ecosystems, but that's another argument about what constitutes invasive and what doesn't. But another thing is silence in the urban landscape is so valued, and there's actually a very simple technique where you can build stackable Helmholtz resonators that actually absorb traffic noise. You could build these sound walls all over cities, and they could be 3D printed, and basically it's a port with a cavity, and you tune it, and it actually eliminates noise. Think of how great it would be to have urban landscapes that are quieter soundscapes So yeah, just getting rid of invasive plants and building these sound wall absorbing landscape walls. I mean, there's just a couple ideas, of how to give people creative, humane work, which gets them, activity and fresh air in the process. And, you don't have to do it, 10 hours a week, writes Alan, building these sound walls or making invasive plants go away. So yeah, I think the cities are really the wealth of civilization, and that's where we need to start these changes. So, Brandon, are you running for a state assembly, or what's your actual office? I wasn't clear.
The state house.
Okay, yeah, that's a great house. Me, I've run for city council, so far 4 times, and vice president once. But yeah, fully for those who stand for office, it's a really civic responsibility, and it's a lot of fun. I recommend it. If you haven't tried it, please feel free to stand for civic engagement in any form. So back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And it is indeed an interesting idea, Daniel. Perhaps some artists could be retained to paint the soundproof walls or the sound reducing walls, and that could be another outlet for artistic expression. In my view, there is just so much work that is currently undone that could be done and potentially could be done by people if their efforts are recognized as being worthwhile. For example, so many communities have extreme amounts of litter, in my view, but there's not really a clear market mechanism to facilitate litter cleanup right now. Perhaps one could be arrived at. Or in U.S. forest land, there's a lot of dried vegetation on the ground that is prime fuel for wildfires to spread. If crews of people, maybe people aided by robots, could be dispatched to clear the dead vegetation or trim back some of the brush, that would greatly reduce the wildfire risk. And there are so many of these kinds of activities that perhaps a lot of people today would consider incidental, but if they're performed consistently and reliably, could greatly increase our standards of living, that in a society that finds the way to fund these kinds of activities, there will be plenty of work to do. I think a lot of people right now are channeled into a relatively small number of occupations just because those are the occupations for which a business model has been figured out and ways to internalize the positive externalities have been figured out. But there are a lot of positive externalities, for instance, for cleaning up litter or, say, painting murals in public spaces, which is increasingly being done, that perhaps need some special policies or programs to be able to implement. So
I would just add that all that picked up cellulosic biomass can be put in a pyrolyzer and made into biochar, which can then be cycled back into the soil as it becomes a life raft for microbes in the soil. And really all landscaping in the urban environment should be permacultural. It should be perennial fruit trees and things like that. So just simple changes that we can do, as policy changes at the municipal level, which don't take a lot of money or time or protesting. But yeah, I just wanted to get in a good word for taking that.
I absolutely agree with the permaculture. Definitely. I've always believed that both cities and homes ideally should function as a cell.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and permaculture, I might say, is a portmanteau of permanent agriculture, and it works on zones. The areas closest to you are zone 0, so you want to put the most accessible things in that zone, and the little farther away is zone 1, 2, 3. And then you have guilds of plants that are, root to canopy. So it's a whole ecosystem. And really, the indigenous people discovered this ecosystem long before, Western people academized it in textbooks. I think we've been doing it for 10,000 years without realizing it. But, like the corn bean squash of the 3 sisters that the indigenous people used to make complete protein diets. But yeah, hooray for permaculture. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Now, Alan Crowley has a question for Brandon. Alan, please go ahead.
Yeah, kind of along the lines of the permaculture is these very low tech, smart technologies. And you mentioned gray water in your housing sovereignty, water reuse. And I just wanted to find out, is that already in use in Minnesota? Or, I mean, because that does tend to increase the cost of production for any housing unit, but it's still the operational cost recoups it, I'm sure.
As far as I'm aware, no. I was told that it would be best for me to make sure that I include a carve out in there, which I did, because all of these parts are optional for these homes, but philosophically, the idea behind the sovereign home is they're very Earthship inspired. Like the Earthships down in New Mexico, the dirt packed tire berm walls. It's very Earthship inspired, and the rainwater catchment and the gray water reuse, those are all drawn from Earthship ideas.
Cool.
Very interesting. And now I think we have an opportunity to delve a bit into the concept of a technological singularity. Brandon, you mentioned that you have a non-mystical view of this idea of a singularity. So could you please describe what your view is and your outlook on the possibilities for humankind's future?
Okay, so the popular narrative is that the exponential curves guarantee redemption, that when 2045 arrives, history will be rescued by default. I don't believe that. I believe that the singularity is an amplifier, and it will amplify whatever feedstock we give it. If we give it tyranny, hierarchy, control, well, that's what it will accelerate. So the idea is that sovereign homes are the proof of concept for what I call liberation infrastructure, which is basically the technology of Venus Project cities in embryo.
Very interesting. And in terms of how a positive, beneficial singularity would manifest itself, what are some of your ideas as to what that would provide in terms of possibilities for a better future?
So the way that I believe that if we want to pass our great filter, we need to start getting this infrastructure at least passed on the federal level by 2033. That would give us enough runway to get it going throughout the country. And the way that I see it is that the emerging technologies should be used to decentralize both power and the means of production as close to the individual level as possible. And what the singularity will do is it will take the liberty that we've already encoded into the infrastructure in the 2030s and then supercharge it. Like, I don't believe that we'll have like homes that have atomic scale recyclers in them in the 2030s. That will be stuff that we get in the 2050s after the singularity.
Very interesting.
Like when your home can 3D print a brand new car and a steak for dinner, that's when you have achieved eudaimonia.
So those would be, in essence, the Star Trek replicators.
I mean, we've had rudimentary atomic scale manufacturing since 2018.
Yes, this is a fascinating prospect. And of course, this dovetails with the idea of sustainable superabundance that has been articulated by David Wood, and also the ideas of abundance as expressed by figures as diverse as Peter Diamandis and Ezra Klein. So it seems that there are voices of various persuasions who are recognizing these possibilities and in general are aligned with us in seeing them as desirable. Now, I also agree with you that a singularity doesn't guarantee utopia or a perfect society or a society that's free of conflicts. In my view, humankind has already experienced 3 technological singularities: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the information revolution. And each of these transformations led to societies and ways of doing things, interacting with the world that would have been unimaginable to most people prior to those developments, those transformative eras. And I think the next singularity is likely to be of that sort, where a convergence of emerging technologies, including automation, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, this kind of abundance-driven manufacturing with 3D printing, with the ability to replicate most objects, at least on a human scale. The convergence of these technologies will lead to a world that radically differs from the world in which we find ourselves. But you mentioned there are pitfalls, and I'm wondering also what you think some of the less desirable turns might be. You mentioned the Elysium Ready Player One combination. I would suggest there is a risk of escalating geopolitical tensions leading to nuclear war and potentially the extinction of our species. That would be the worst outcome. How would you evaluate the possible trajectories and essentially any benchmarks that would tell us which trajectory we're on? You mentioned you would want to have the liberation infrastructure supported by federal law in some manner by 2033. Are there any other goalposts that we could aim at to be on the positive trajectory?
Back in 2014, I expected that we would begin nationalized asteroid mining this year. Instead, the very next year, Trump came on the scene, and here we are. So when we talked about the axis of Endarkenment and how that's functionally the real life Illuminati, that's the primary goalpost, as far as I can see, showing us that we are currently on the path to extinction.
Now, it's interesting, though, because I like the idea of asteroid mining and the idea of using the proceeds of that for universal basic income or creation of infrastructure, some sort of way to distribute the abundance from that to the people, because it doesn't require taking anything from anyone. These are additional resources that could be brought to bear. And furthermore, they wouldn't result in inflation because there would be some useful materials extracted from the asteroid. So it's not like printing money and dropping it out of a helicopter. Now, I also am inclined to think that someone like Donald Trump wouldn't be averse to that option or that approach, even though Donald Trump is definitely out for his own enrichment. He might be persuaded to see it as a combination of a vanity project and a way to fulfill his promises. Like he could say, I, Donald Trump, will bring you this tremendous wealth from this asteroid, and I will spread it throughout the population because it will all be coming from me, and I am so great, and I am so generous, and you should love me and respect me, Donald Trump, for bringing you this wealth from the asteroid. And I wonder, could there be opportunities to, let's say, utilize the venal or opportunistic or self-aggrandizing tendencies of some of these powerful people to actually lead to some public good? Because again, it seems Trump's personality might be open to such a project.
So after seeing Mamdani, America's mayor, handling Trump, it made me think maybe we've been going about this the wrong way and we should have been doing that from the beginning. But personally, I believe that the route to go is framing nationalized asteroid mining as the next great American endeavor.
Yes.
Not just the national endeavor. It needs to be the Trump legacy. I mean, he did get the FIFA Peace Prize, and he did, get but those quite literally would pale in comparison to a singular piece of legislation, which would be the tow random asteroids. I don't know. I can't get an acronym out of Trump, but the Trump legacy. Oh, he might just fall on that with. Who knows? Maybe you're right. He should have been doing it all along. He's a crook, and he wants money and fame. Give him money and fame.
Yes.
The bigger problem, in my opinion, would be the billionaires, around him, like the Musks and the Thiels, because that's the thing. Trump, he's always just been a figurehead.
Well, I think when you have global crooks, maybe you need, it takes a thief sometimes. Maybe you need a crook for freedom, to counteract all these authoritarian crooks. I don't know. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt to an extent, but yeah, the art of the asteroid deal. Let's pitch it.
Yes, Musk might want a piece of the action because keep in mind, Musk owns SpaceX, and Musk, for all of his faults, has contributed something to building up the infrastructure of humanity with companies like Tesla, SpaceX, to a lesser extent Solar City because it got absorbed by Tesla, and the Boring Company, which has built a few tunnels, but not as many as were promised, or concepts like the Hyperloop, which unfortunately haven't had nearly as much investment as they should have. I think the issue with Musk is he lets himself be distracted by extraneous goals. At least they should be extraneous for a more reasonable person, like fighting the culture wars or the whole Doge fiasco. If Elon Musk had stayed in his many legitimate lanes, I think he would have been able to do a lot more good. But in this case, Musk might be tempted to go along with the asteroid mining. He might be tempted to supply spacecraft through SpaceX to the missions to actually harness these asteroids and extract useful materials. And again, he seems to be the kind of person who, with the sufficient incentives, might be persuaded to play along. So I am actually less worried, even though I see the problems with what they're doing, about the non-ideological, more opportunistic types, because I think they could be brought around, at least in practice, to support some of these initiatives. I am worried about the people on both the extreme right and the extreme left who have hardline ideological opposition to the goals of transhumanism. On the extreme right, these will likely be either religious fundamentalists or alt-right conspiracy theorists, bioconservatives, people who say we must not tamper with God's will. We must not try to play God. On the left, these would be the neo-Malthusians, the neo-Luddites, who think that man is a cancer upon this earth and we need to return to unsullied nature. They have this ideal of nature prior to man as somehow being noble and good and humans as having corrupted it. And it seems that those extremists on both sides of the conventional political spectrum are more difficult, less tractable, because they have set ideologies that oppose ours. What do you think about this? And in particular, what do you think about a figure whom I thought to be a bit more reasonable, Pope Leo XIV, coming out against transhumanism just in the past few days, essentially saying that death should be accepted as a part of life. It shouldn't be rejected as being antagonistic to life.
Okay, so first of all, on the Pope, I just wrote a comment the other day on, if I could find it, anyway, on Zoltan Esteban's post about that on Instagram. And I explained that from my perspective, Pope Leo isn't against us, he's against the axis of Endarkenment. Because transhumanism itself, as a broad movement, is descended from the Enlightenment. And he's made it very clear that he is the first Enlightenment Pope. And then as far as the far left, so the anarcho-primitivists, personally, I've always seen that as one of the most genocidal ideologies out there. Like, if you actually take it to its logical conclusion, there will be billions of unnecessary deaths as a direct result. And then, personally, I heavily disagree with allowing any of the oligarch class to be involved in nationalized asteroid mining, just because, like, when we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of resources, privatization, that just feels like a bad direction right out the gate.
Interesting. So how do you propose countering the ideological opponents of transhumanism? And if you believe, for instance, that Pope Leo isn't really an ideological opponent of transhumanism, how would you go about trying to persuade him to not oppose our goals?
I mean, for Pope Leo, hitting him in the Enlightenment, like, that's the thing. We are, at the end of the day, we are all allies with liberty and freedom and justice and dignity. And my perspective with radical life extension is, whether you want to live 40 years or 4,000, that should be a personal choice that you make. It shouldn't be forced on you. Like, if you don't want to live that long, nobody should tell you that you have to.
Yes, and of course, transhumanists will agree that it should be a personal choice, and there shouldn't be a mandate to accept any sort of therapy or treatment. There shouldn't be a mandate today to accept medical treatment if one doesn't wish to. Now, the issue, of course, right now is that involuntary death will befall all too many people, even if they don't seek it, don't choose it, even if they wish to avoid it, because of aging, because we have not been able to escape the scourge of aging as of yet with our technologies. So I would say the key goal of transhumanists is to give people that choice, to give them that option by advancing technologies sufficiently far. But when bioconservatives of various persuasions say, well, this shouldn't be done, in part because they don't have any experience of a world in which this has been done, that is where the potential limitations on the choice could occur if those people achieve positions of power, are able to control policy. This has already happened in certain eras, say in the early 2000s with the George W. Bush administration and the President's Council on Bioethics, where there was a very influential advisor named Leon Kass, who essentially believes that death is an integral part of life. It gives humans purpose, and humans shouldn't live much longer than current lifespans with decent medical care. So he wouldn't be opposed to people routinely living into their mid-80s or even some people living into their 90s, but he would say it's bad for whatever reason for people to be able to live beyond 120. And what I'm concerned about, and what many transhumanists are concerned about, would be some group of people of that persuasion, whether that stems from right-wing or left-wing thinking, gaining control of the levers of power and telling others, you may not make that choice to extend your life. You have to accept the conventional lifespans, maybe with a few medical quality of life improvements here or there.
But, could I add to that and say, what if we get future generations to be immortal? Shouldn't that be a consolation prize, even if we can't personally be immortal ourselves? I wish more transhumanists would put their shoulder to that wheel to make future generations have the possibility of indefinite longevity. I know that's not a big selling point right now.
I call that conditional ancestralism.
Okay. Is that a bad thing or a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. It's conditional ancestralism is absolutely a good thing. Like, that's the thing. Too many people these days are more worried about being good descendants than they are about being good ancestors.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. Thanks for that.
Yes. Well, I would say indefinite lifespans or even dramatically longer lifespans will give people longer time horizons. So if you can expect to live long enough to see your great, great, great grandchildren personally, then you might care about them more as well. You might plan for their well-being. You might plan for a world in which they don't have to face certain difficulties.
So,
So,
Gennady,
Brandon,
going back
please go
to your question there, what you're talking about with, like, say if the Luddites seize the levers of power, for example, that's exactly why the primary goal of liberation infrastructure is decentralizing power and the means of production as close to the individual as technologically possible. When it comes to my life and my body, like, people shouldn't be able to just force me to not do something as if I'm not causing harm to others. I'm very big on the harm principle.
Yes. So the idea of people having their sovereign homes, their time and space, access to infrastructure for living and producing would be that it would be more difficult to control them or restrict them from some centralized node, be that a government or a private corporation. No entity would be able to intrude upon that private sphere and say, no, you are prohibited from, say, experimenting with these technologies as long as that experimentation applies to yourself. Instead, people will have the means to do that on hand, and it would be very difficult to stop. Am I understanding that vision correctly?
Yes, and that's actually part of the reason why philosophically it's very Earthship inspired. If your home produces a measurable amount of your water, your food, and your energy, then suddenly, if, say, a wannabe despot seizes the nation's fresh waterways, seizes the nation's farmland, well, now that's suddenly not crippling. That's suddenly no longer a centralized point of failure.
All right, very good. Thank you, Brandon. And we have one question from Alan Crowley, which I think is also an invitation to a closing statement from you. So Alan asks, how many votes do you need from Texas? Of course, you're running for office in Minnesota, but what can people from Texas or elsewhere, what can members of the U.S. Transhumanist Party do to help your campaign if they are aligned with it? And also, what message would you have for our members in connection with a forthcoming vote where they will be able to choose whether to endorse you as a candidate?
So, to get to your second part first, well, I would say that my platform is fundamentally as transhumanist as it gets. It's directly in line with every single one of the goals that the Transhumanist Party is out to get. And then what was the first part again?
So the first part was in regard to Alan's question. Essentially, what could people do in other states or outside of your district to help your campaign?
So genuinely, right now, fundraising, like, I've only raised $100 total so far, but granted that it was a month after my 17,000 follower TikTok account was banned. So I'm recovering from that. Otherwise, just helping to spread the ideas around, which I'm sure in your circles would be, very highly favored upon, versus what a lot of other people might be bringing to them.
All right. Thank you very much, Brandon. And it was fascinating conversing with you for this virtual Enlightenment Salon. As I had hoped, we touched on both policy questions and broader philosophical questions as to the potential trajectories for humanity, how we can achieve the brightest future possible. So thank you for joining us today, Brandon, and I hope that we can all live long and prosper.